Welcome to the Advance Your Art podcast, where we talk about the journey from artist to entrepreneur and everything in between. You've worked hard to hone your craft. Now take it to the next level with tips, techniques, strategies and routines used by successful artists to grow their businesses and careers. Now, let's get started and have some fun with your host, Yuri Cataldo.
Hello, John. Welcome to the show. How are you this evening?
Well, I'm very well, thank you, Yuri. Lovely to be here.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining me. And I guess it's in the afternoon where you are, which is also interesting as well.
Yes, it's the afternoon tomorrow.
Yes,
for
that's
you.
right. I like that. I like that you're calling me from the future. So
we're ahead of times here, yeah.
Yes. So for my listeners who are not as familiar with your work, how do you describe yourself and what you do?
Well, I would say mostly I'm an educator, a creative educator, and so I teach people to manage emotions. Primarily, I teach them at work, in the work context, but what my hidden agenda is to teach people about emotions in every aspect of their life, because they're the same people who go to work and at home and everywhere else. So I teach people really to manage emotions.
Mm-hmm. Oh, excellent. So let's start a little bit from the beginning. So you originally went to school for anthropology and then theology. What made you want to study those? Well,
the anthropology, when I left school, high school, I was a volunteer in Tonga. I was teaching basic English and math and science. I was 18 years old. I lived with a family. I learned the language. I got quite really immersed in that whole culture. When I came back to New Zealand from there, after 1 year, I entered the seminary and studied theology, with the view to being ordained as a priest, which I was 8 years later. It was a good long training period.
Yeah.
And
is that
part of
is it usually 8 years to train as a priest?
Well, actually, it was 7, and then when I turned up, they changed it to 8.
That was nice of them.
I'm not sure if there was a cause and effect there, but anyhow, it was the complete way of life right from then. Anyway, once we began that training, we were wearing the habit and all kinds of and just basically living the life. During that time. And when I was ordained, I taught for 5 years and was doing part-time study. And I was really interested in anthropology and different cultures and how people are different. And wanted to go back and work in the Pacific, actually, as a priest, which I only did for a short time during vacation, during the school. But those are my two big interests at the time, was the particularly Pacific people and specifically Tonga, as well as wanting to become a priest. So I did theology.
Oh, great. So you were working in the clergy for a while, and then did your career, was it still part of your work with the priesthood, or did you move on to another career when you became more interested in emotional intelligence?
I think that it's more like the latter. I started, so I taught for 5 years, then actually burnt myself out doing that because I was also working as a chaplain to the Tongan community in Wellington and doing many other things, plus nearly, quite heavy study. So I shifted to work in a parish in another city, and then I knew that I needed to do some personal work, and this really, so I started with myself, and then the woman I ended up, she was a psychiatrist and a psychodramatist, and she was running a group for psychodrama, and then said, invited me to come and join this group. And I used to think, particularly when I got into the training, I'm there to help my parishioners, but actually I was the one who needed most help. That life really had shut me down quite a lot. I was being less creative and less flow. And it really wasn't until I started doing that training and my personal work that went with it that I realized it was really about me and not about me trying to help other people. Now that process took maybe 4 or 5 years to do enough work, and then I realized actually it's time to move. So I had been working by that stage as a priest for about 11 years, and then I said, okay, it's time to leave, and was able to do that.
So what does studying psychodrama and becoming a psychodramatist entail?
Well, it's a very intense training. Mostly people don't learn it in the university, partly because it involves much more, a lot of personal work and skills. So the training is all done in groups, and mostly it was kind of weekend groups, or even sometimes, in fact, I did a practicum for 10 weeks full time at one point. So you basically do a group, and you learn how to run the method by practicing on one another under supervision with trainers. And we had some wonderful trainers here in Australia and New Zealand. And so as you do that, so it took me 10 years to qualify, and I would have done probably maybe 20 or 30 days training during a year when I was really going for it. And in that process, you deal with issues from your own life and actually get to resolve them. And then when you're ready, you can take the exam, and you do that. There's a written, you have to write what we call a number of papers, actually, and then do a practical examination, running a group with the examiner. You run it for about an hour and a half, and then you you stop and have 20 minutes to collect your thoughts, and then you go and present your reasoning and the reasons why you did things and what happened. And it's a very, very intense training. But it's the best training that I've ever had, that's for sure. Beats all the other degrees. I've got 3 degrees and various things, but that's really has set me up to work with people.
Yeah, wonderful. So with this training then, you then decided that you wanted to write a book called Thriving Under Fire. What made you want to be an author, and what is your book about? Right.
Well, after I need to, that's a bit of a jump, because once I qualified as a psychodramatist, I got a job and worked for about 5 years in a drug and alcohol rehabilitation hospital. Then when that started closing down, it's unfortunately now completely closed through lack of funding. Then I started up my business, training people to manage emotions in the workplace, and I came to that after a couple of years. But it's an interesting thing really about writing a book, because I'm an extrovert. I just, sitting down and writing is the last thing on my mind. And in fact, even when I was at high school, I wasn't particularly good at English. But over the years, I've taught myself to write, and so I was writing blogs and things like that. But really, I realized that this message needed to get out, and it was one of those things. It was in me. And people talk about this, there's a book in you, and they say there's a book in everybody, or several books really. But this one was ready to hatch. And so I was part of the National Speakers Association, which is also connected in the US, that organization. And they do a lot of coaching on how to write a book and how to get these things out there. And I'd listen to lots of, particularly podcasts, or more, back then they were, magazines delivered on CD discs. But listen to a lot of these speakers who was saying, this is how to do it, and this is how I did it, and how you can do it. And I was reading a lot myself. So what I did with my book, I thought, what's the story, what's the vehicle I could get my ideas out there with? And the name of my business is Thriving Under Fire, Tough. Mm-hmm. And at first I was thinking to use a military analogy, and apart from the fact that I'm more of a pacifist than anything, and I just thought, no, that wouldn't really resonate, particularly wouldn't resonate with women so much. And so I came up with this idea of setting a story in a cafe. And so each day I go, and this is a hard case lady who runs the cafe, and she's actually under a lot of pressure and wanting to expand it into a restaurant. And over 2 or 3 weeks, I go in there each day because I'm working in that town, and we have, something happens, and that gives me the opportunity to teach her something, one of the principles of my program. And it was a lot of fun. And I actually wrote it on holiday. I'd get up early in the morning and have a chapter in mind. I had it all planned out, what chapters I'd cover. And each day I got up and at 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning and just wrote for a couple of hours. And after two weeks or so, I had the whole thing, the bones of it written. Fortunately, my family, they all slept in at that time, so I had the peace and quiet of this very little holiday house to myself. And it was a wonderful experience writing. I felt like I was a writer when I did that. There was still plenty of work to be done on it, of course, and I had a good editor and a wonderful publisher who helped me a lot and turned it into a really good piece of work.
Wonderful.
So that's how my book came about.
Sure, yeah. Sure. And I apologize. I know we skipped over, you're right, the start of your business, which is around, again, the same title as your book. So what was it about wanting to help, again, people with emotional intelligence that made you want to start this particular company?
I've always wanted to help people. That's why I went and worked in Tonga as a volunteer. It's why I became a priest. So this is something that is very natural to me to do that. But I just used to see so many people getting into relationship difficulties because they didn't know how to manage emotions. And I particularly learned this working at the hospital, where patients would come to the group. They'd be told to come to the psychodrama group and deal with some issues from their childhood that were triggering their drinking and drugging. And when they first presented and they'd stand up in the group and say, I've been told to come, I'm going to do this, they would get very emotional, and quite often it was too much for them, and they would storm out of the room and slam the door and do things like that. And what I worked out after several months there is that in that moment, what I did next made all the difference as to whether they would storm out and slam the door, or whether they would calm down and do the work they were meant to do. And when I realized and started seeing that everywhere in life, not just in the hospital, then I knew that I could teach this to people. And it's at one level it's very simple, another level it's quite difficult to do. So it's both simple and difficult.
Excellent, as most things are. Is there and again, I know that you have some more courses that really develop and dive deep into this, but for the listeners, is there a couple of just ideas that you can give them about how to kind of calm down in the moment and not be overcome by emotions? Yeah,
sure there is. And I love to share this because it's so important. The more people get it. But in that moment, when somebody else is upset, and they might be swearing and shouting, or just even be very coldly negative towards you, whatever it is, you end up reacting. And it's almost, it's contagious. You can't help it, actually.